Metabolism is the set of life-sustaining chemical reactions in the body that transforms food into energy. The digestive system helps break and move the food and liquid that we're going to eat. Once the food is broken down into small pieces, then the body can absorb and move the nutrients to all the cells in the body. The cells in the body are going to use amino acids, fatty acids, sugars, and glycerol that are going to be found in the food to build substances the body needs for energy, growth, and repair. Obviously, this carbohydrate is going to come, for example, from the bread. Proteins are going to be obtained from the meat, and triglycerides, fats, are going to be obtained from the cheese, for example. However, do all the cells perform the same function? The answer is no. Therefore, the transformation of food into energy depends on the cell. Consequently, we're going to find that there are two kinds of cells, energetic cells and biosynthetic cells. Energetic cells are those high energy production cells. That means that they're going to produce a lot of ATP. For example, cardiac cells. They need to make a lot of ATP because the heart itself needs to contract in order to pump the blood throughout the body. And they need to use a little bit of that energy for a biosynthetic capacity in order to maintain basically that cell homeostasis. The other type of cells that we're going to have are going to be biosynthetic cells. These cells are going to display a pronounced capacity for biosynthetic conversion of nutrients into cellular building blocks. For example, the liver cells, hepatocytes, they are going to take these carbohydrates, amino acids, etc., in order to produce other substances such as, for example, enzymes and antibodies that our body is going to use. So therefore, we have two main types of cells, energetic cells, as we mentioned before, and biosynthetic cells. Examples of those, in the case of energetic cell, is going to be the cardiac cell, right, the cardiac muscle, because in this case, these cells are going to use the energy in the food and it's going to be converted into ATP, but that ATP is going to be used mainly for energy purposes, so the heart can actually pump the blood 24/7. However, a little piece of that energy is going to be used in order to maintain homeostasis of the cardiac cell. The opposite of that is going to be the biosynthetic cell, the cells that you have in your liver, the hepatocytes. In this case, these cells are going to use most of the energy to create or to synthesize new substances, such as, for example, enzymes. However, a small percentage of the energy is going to be used to maintain homeostasis in the cell. While cardiac cells and hepatocytes represent the opposite ends of the spectrum about energy consumption, most of the cells are going to fall in between these two. So based on this type of cells, what are the functions of metabolism? Well, metabolism is going to have three main functions. One of them is conversion of energy in food to cellular energy, which is going to be ATP. So then this is what the cardiac cells are going to do. And the next one is going to be the conversion of energy in food to building blocks. This is what the liver cells, the hepatocytes, are going to do. And obviously the third function is going to be the elimination of metabolic waste. However, we don't eat food every minute of our lives, but the heart beats every minute of our lives. So our body is going to have mechanisms to make sure that we don't have to eat every single minute of our life. So the body is going to process the food that we're going to eat immediately, and even more important than that, is going to store energy for later demands. If we wouldn't have a process by which we store the energy, then that would mean that we would have to eat basically every single minute of our life to constantly meet the energy demands of our body, for example, the energy demands that the heart is going to have. Therefore, there are three metabolic states. You're going to have the absorptive or fed state, the post-absorptive or fasting state, and starvation. During the day, the body is switching between the fed state and the fasting state. Starvation is not common in well-nourished individuals. So we have different mechanisms in place to facilitate this storage of energy and to make this stored energy available during times of fasting and starvation. So we have the absorptive state or fed state. The fed state is going to happen after the meal, when the body is digesting the food and absorbing the nutrients. And depending on the amount of food that we're going to eat and the type of food that we're going to eat, it can last up to 4 hours. The digestion of carbohydrates is going to start in the mouth, and the digestion of proteins and fats starts in the stomach and continues in the intestines. The constituent parts of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are transported across the intestinal wall and enter the bloodstream, for example, sugars and amino acids. And in the lymphatic system, what we're going to transport is going to be fats. The ingestion of food and the rise of glucose concentrations in the bloodstream will stimulate the pancreas to release insulin into the bloodstream. If energy is necessary immediately, then the fats and the sugars that we just ingested will be processed and used immediately for energy. If we are not going to use the energy immediately, then insulin will stimulate the absorption and storage of excess glucose as glycogen in the liver and muscle cell, or as fat in the adipose tissue. And the excess fat will also be stored as triglycerides, but in the adipose tissue. Post-absorptive state or fasting state. The fasting state is going to happen when the food has been digested, absorbed, and stored. For example, when we are sleeping. However, another way in which we can get into the fasting state is when we're skipping meals during the day, and that's going to cause the glucose levels to drop. However, your body still have demands, and because of that, the levels of glucose must be maintained within a normal range, which is going to be 80 to 120 milligrams per deciliter. Then the hormone glucagon is going to be released by the pancreas. During this state, the body must rely on the stored glycogen. Glucagon will act on the liver cells, and these cells will stimulate the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. As a result of that, the blood glucose levels will increase. This increase in blood glucose is used by the peripheral tissues and the brain. Gluconeogenesis, which is the synthesis of glucose from sources other than carbohydrates, will also begin in the liver in order to replace the glucose that has been used by the peripheral tissues. The excess glucose that is absorbed by the liver will be converted into triglycerides and fatty acids for long-term storage. During starvation, your body is deprived from nourishment for an extended period of time, and your body will go into survival mode. The first priority is going to be to provide enough glucose to the brain, and the second priority would be the conservation of amino acids for proteins. During starvation, fatty acids and triglycerides stored are used to create ketone bodies. As starvation continues and more glucose is needed, ketone bodies will become the major source of fuel for the heart and other organs. This prevents the continued breakdown of proteins to serve as carbon sources for gluconeogenesis. Once the fatty acids and triglycerides are fully depleted, proteins from muscles are released and broken down for glucose synthesis. The overall survival is dependent on the amount of fat and protein stored in the body, because during starvation, glucose has been consumed a long time ago. So to summarize, we have three metabolic states: starvation, fasting state, and fed state. In these different states, we're going to use the energy in order to supply the body requirements. But what is the base of these body requirements? For that, we're going to have the basal metabolic rate, or BMR. The BMR is the amount of energy needed to maintain the body functioning while the person is awake but completely rested and in a temperate environment. Basal metabolism is usually the largest component of the person's total caloric needs because in such a state, the energy will be used to maintain homeostasis of the vital organs. Approximately 70% of all the calories and energy burned in the body is due to upkeep. Physical activity takes maybe 20% of the expenditure, and 10% is going to be used for other activities such as food digestion. Calories are taken into the body as food is eaten, and after the food is digested, it's broken down into different organic compounds such as glucose. Mitochondria converts the caloric energy from food into ATP, which is an energy form that can be used by the cells. One ATP produces 7.3 kilocalories of energy. You can use this calculator to find the BMR. To do that, go to calculator.net and select BMR calculator. Check the red arrow on this screen. Once the BMR calculator opens, enter your information and person Q information in the BMR calculator to answer question 2. Read question 2 for details. To select the answer for question 2 in detail, you will have to provide a range. For example, let's assume that your BMR is 600 and person Q BMR is 700. Then the range would be between 500 and 1000. In D12, you will find a series of ranges. For example, 5 to 20, 30 to 50, 100 to 500, 500 to 1000, etc. I suggest to write down your BMR and person Q BMR
to select the correct range when answering question number 2 in D2L.